Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. There are over 160 interviews in this podcast series, all of which you can enjoy on aarecoveryinterviews.com and on all podcast apps. Today I'm pleased to welcome Laura B., who got sober at age 17 after 4 years of intensively developing her alcoholism for qualification into AA. In that first meeting, she picked up a desire chip that initiated her 37 years of sobriety as an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous. A compelling aspect of Laura's story is that her father was in AA and her mother was in Al-Anon. They used the tools of their respective programs to effectively deal with Laura's alcoholism, neither preaching nor trying to cajole Laura into quitting. They allowed her to ride her own disease to the bottom, and when she was finally done drinking, helped her get into inpatient treatment followed by AA. From the minute she first joined AA, Laura embraced the program, learning from older members how to live a sober life to the fullest. Though a move to a small West Texas town in the early years of her sobriety disrupted the quantity and continuity of her meetings, Laura persevered and kept her program front and center in her life. The indispensable value of AA fellowship was demonstrated after Laura's father committed suicide, linked to his battle with clinical depression. Laura was enveloped in the same loving support that she had been showing others in her AA meetings. And the tragic occurrence of her father's death gave Laura a pause to understand the differences between the alcoholism that her father recovered from in AA and the disease of clinical depression that AA cannot address. Laura continued her passionate commitment to share her understanding with others. Back living in Austin, Laura is very active in sponsorship and service to this day. Laura's willingness to share her story has been a fine gift to me, and I'm thrilled to share it with you. It's a story that's both inspirational and intriguing. And though Zoom audio was somewhat lackluster the day we taped this, the content is still top drawer. So please enjoy the next 60 minutes with my friend and AA sister, Laura B.
My name's Laura. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Laura. That's the proper response. Isn't that amazing? We go so far along in life without people saying hi, and then we're in a program that every meeting we go to, we can be sure that if we get called on, people will say hi back to us. Isn't that wonderful? Well, I really appreciate you doing this today. You and I have not met in person. We've met via Zoom. Were you going to a lot of in-person meetings before you went to Zoom? Did you participate more in Zoom once it was virtual as opposed to in-person?
Yes. So I have always done a ton of in-person meetings. And then almost 8 years ago now, the granddaughter that I was just mentioning before was born. And I've had her since she was born. Mm-hmm. And so my ability to attend in-person meetings changed. Mm-hmm. When I got sober and had my kids, we had a babysitter at my home group.
Oh, wow.
And so I could still go. We had every day at 5:30 and 8 o'clock, the facility provided a sitter.
Wow.
And they had a special room. And so you could take your kids and drop your kids off and go to a meeting.
That's awesome.
But where I was living when I got Harper did not have that. And so I was making one, maybe two in-person meetings a week prior to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Still being sponsored, actively sponsoring, thank God, and still doing 12-step work. But the meetings were tough because of having Harper. So Zoom was quite the godsend for me. It really was, because I just couldn't get to the meetings that I wanted to go to. And then all of a sudden, everyone was in my living room. It was fabulous.
Now, you're in Chicago?
No, Austin, just outside of Austin.
Okay, yeah. I've done a lot of interviews with people in Austin. I've been to quite a few meetings there myself.
Yeah.
So how long have you been sober? What's your sobriety date?
April the 6th of 1987 is my sobriety date, so 37 years. It was a really great time to come into Alcoholics Anonymous. Uh-huh. And we got a really incredible foundation. And there's a lot of us that have stayed, not just stayed sober, but stayed sober and involved.
Have you been in Austin this whole time?
You know, I got sober in Austin and was there until 93. I moved out to West Texas for, I guess, 5 years, and then moved back to Austin in 98.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now about an hour outside of Austin, 45 minutes.
What was it like when you moved out to West Texas, having been sober for a number of years before you actually went out there?
You know, it was very difficult because I had been at the same group my entire sobriety, and I was used to the way things were done and having familiar faces and the same people. And so it was a very, very dark time for me. It was a difficult transition for me. And I had been there, I moved there in September of 93. My oldest daughter was about 15 months old, and I was pregnant with my second daughter. And then when I was about 7 months pregnant, so in February of 94, my dad committed suicide. He was sober and committed suicide. And it was just, but I'll tell you, I think at that point, the AA community in West Texas really rallied around. And and that's where I started really making connections with sober people, because they really showed up for me. So as difficult as that was, it did allow me to have some community that I hadn't had before, just because I was really judgmental about the way they were doing it wrong. You know, they had all been sober for decades. You know, I mean, there was some really, really amazing sobriety out there, but I just couldn't see it because it was different.
Sometimes we don't know just how close we are to the people in the program until something like that happens, and we need that rally. We need the people to encompass us. And I found the same thing you have, where early in sobriety, some very awful things happen, and I was able to take that into the rooms and get the sympathy, support, and empathy from people that helped me get through that very tough those tough situations without drinking. When you first went to West Texas and you were going to those meetings there, you talked about it kind of being a bleak or black time for you. Was it because of the change in meetings or people, or what contributed to that dark time for you?
I think it was, you know, I moved out there because I was single with a baby and pregnant. And financially, that made a lot more sense. My aunt was out there. Thank God. I think it was really just like my spiritual malady, being untreated more than anything. I was very tired, physically, emotionally, spiritually. I was very tired. And there was some stuff like, you know, Austin is a very liberal city. I was raised in Austin. And when I got out to West Texas, there was one man in particular. His name was Johnny. He became a very good friend of mine. Johnny's African American, and like there were people that wouldn't hold his hand to say the prayer. And I mean, it was 1993, you know what I mean? And I was just like, oh my God. And so there were things like that that just kind of kept me at a distance. I immediately started working with newcomers, which really saved my life. And I never quit going to meetings. I didn't like the meetings, and I went to lots of different meetings trying to figure out where I fit. But I never quit going to meetings. I've never stopped being involved in AA, and I think that's a life changer. But I think for me, it really was until I got out there and I got a sponsor, and then my dad died. And after my dad died, really the community is what really held me in good stead for a while. And I had great sponsorship at that point, and that helped a lot. But I think the change was there was a grief process for me in leaving my home, you know, leaving my home group and leaving my hometown. But I just couldn't afford to live there.
Sounds like you had some real challenges kind of gang up on you all at once. You were pregnant, you had a little one, your father committed suicide, but he was sober. Was he sober in AA when he did that? What were, if you don't mind me asking, what were the circumstances around that?
So he suffered from depression his whole life, and And I think a couple of things happened. I think he initially thought that he could work the steps on his depression, and tried to treat a medical problem with a spiritual solution. And then my folks moved out to Virginia from Texas for his job.
Yeah.
And when he got to Virginia, where they were in Virginia was a very, I don't know what the word is for it, but they were not strong. It was not strong recovery. And we, come from big book country. And so he got out there and it was like, oh, well, let's ask Bill what he thinks and let's find out what, and I think his ego allowed him to be placed in a position of not necessarily authority, but that he had the answers in AA. And then when the wheels came off, if you're the person, he was on a pedestal, right?
Right.
And it's tough if you're on that pedestal and you're not okay. What do you do? And so I think it was a combination of, he had medication at times. He took himself off of medication, which is pretty common.
Yeah.
Because he would feel better, stop taking the medicine. But ultimately, I think what got him was the alcoholic ego and not being able to say to somebody like, I'm not okay. And so, he was a wonderful man, and our relationship had been healed up, and thank God for it. We were on good terms. And talked to him for a long time the day before he died. And I just think with some time and distance, that's my assessment of it. Now, I will tell you, right, my mother has a different take on it. I don't know what my brother's take on it is, but my mother really believes it was just the depression. But I know a lot of people that suffer from depression that stay sober and get help, and you know what I mean? So it doesn't really hold for me that it was only the depression. I think it also was coupled with this allowing himself to sort of be placed on a pedestal in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a pretty dangerous place to be,
Yeah, I get that, and I've suffered from a clinical depression for a very long time, and it's medication resistant too, which makes it doubly hard. And in the early days of my sobriety, I went to a club that 2 to 3 years in, I sought help. Everything was going okay. In fact, it was going really well in my life. I was newly married. I had a great job. Everything was going great, but I felt terrible all the time, which is an ultimate sign of clinical depression. And I went to see a doctor, and he prescribed medication. And when I brought that news back to my AA meetings, there were some old timers who said, "Oh no, you don't need to be taking pills. You just need to get more grateful. Just go out and write yourself out a gratitude list or whatever else." The problem is everybody who's ever had the blues knows what depression feels like. And when people would tell me, well, just pray more or whistle a happy tune or count your blessings or do another fourth step or whatever. And I did all those things, and I still felt terrible. And somewhere along the way, I ran into some people who said, look, it says in the big book, when you need medical help, get the medical help. And
that's right.
Bill Wilson suffered from severe depression as well, and he sought out, he was on lots of different medications, and he tried a lot of different things to deal with it, as have I. Do you suffer from depression yourself?
No.
Isn't that a blessing?
It's such a blessing. It really skipped me, but I've seen these people in AA act as if they have medical degrees. And it's just a world of ignorance behind it and I think that's a lot of what you described is what happened with my dad, right? He had the job he wanted. Him and my mother were very happy, both in recovery. They had a host of friends. Financially, they were in good shape. And life was still very gray for him.
That's a horrible feeling, too, especially when you've got another disease, a comorbidity there that tells you, well, you could probably take care of this with a few drinks or with some drugs of some kind.
I think that's why he made the choice he made. I'll never know that for sure.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, I said to one of my mentors a few days after he died, I said, AA didn't work. And he said, yes, it did. And I was like, how do you figure? And he said he did not pick up a drink.
Yeah.
He said he had treated his alcoholism. It was the depression that was left untreated, which was such good information for me. And then the other thing he said to me was, you need to focus on the man and not the event. Also terrific, because I was really angry at God and angry at him and angry at Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was 24. I was 7 years sober, but still very young, and it was the beginning. I've since I think it's like 21 or 22 other people that I've buried to suicide. As you well know, that's just part of staying sober for a long time. When we lose people like that, but that experience and that information has been super helpful to me, understanding that this is part of it. And if we don't get the medical help, I sponsor a lot of women now, and I always tell them, right, like, let's work the steps.
Yeah.
And treat the spiritual malady and see what happens. And we work the steps, treat the spiritual malady. They're still suffering from anxiety or depression or whatever. Then it's like, please go see your doctor. And let's see what your doctor's take on it is,
Yeah. It's interesting that your feedback to that person who asked you that, when you said it didn't work, but they said, yeah, it did. He didn't drink. The interesting thing about it is that we can get sober and stay alive and our lives can improve. But when you've got depression and you're not treating it, or even when you are treating it, you've got the disease of depression and alcoholism in the same corner saying, okay, you're sober, but what good does it do? Why should I stay sober? I'm miserable. I feel like killing myself, all these other things. So I think it's such a blessing that you are not only sober, but if the depression has skipped you, and that gives you a really unique perspective to be able to pass on to sponsees and to be able to talk about in the rooms.
And, a couple of things have come out of that. One is, I'm adamant about addressing the experience that you had, and the experience that he had. And anytime that comes up, I get fairly loud about how out of bounds that is, but also, the awareness of not being placed on a pedestal.
Yeah, that's right.
And the cautionary tale, right, of what can happen when we allow ourselves to become somebody in Alcoholics Anonymous, and how dangerous that is to, not be able to tell the truth about how we're doing. I stay practicing against that. You know what I mean? Like, if my sponsees call and say, how are you doing? And it's not a good day, I tell the truth. You know what I mean? So, well, I'm writing inventory. What are you calling me for?
Yeah. Bill Wilson, when you look back on his life, he suffered from depression after AA was already started and he had been around. And part of the thing that I understand contributed to his depression was the fact that he felt like he could not go to an ordinary AA meeting and not be mobbed by people, or not be put on this ultra-high pedestal of, oh, the great Bill Wilson is here, give us some of your wisdom. And I think the day you feel uncomfortable going to an AA meeting is the beginning of the end if you want to maintain sobriety.
I agree. It's just tragic what happened to him. And I'm kind of a history junkie, and was reading some of that, where he went to a meeting in Mexico City and somebody wanted to kiss his hand. You know what I mean? And I just thought, oh my God, like, and I understand it. I do. I get their respect for for the role that he played in what happened, but so hard to be on the receiving end of that. It would kill me.
The point has been driven home in a very personal way for you, because the same thing sounds like happened to your dad. How many years had your dad been sober when he died?
He got sober in 85 and he died in 94. So 8.5 years. He had not quite 2 years more than I did. Yeah.
Not long after you relocated to West Texas.
Yeah, about 7 or 8 months. 7 months maybe after I relocated.
God, that must have turned your world upside down at that time.
It completely changed everything. And now, of course, 30 years later, I look back and I'm like, that was really useful, but surviving it.
So how did you stay sober?
I got really thirsty and I called a friend in Austin and said, I know I'm an alcoholic and I know I can't drink safely.
Mm-hmm.
And I no longer give a shit, pardon my French. And I said, now what do I do?
Yeah.
And he said, I watch basketball. And I said, what? You know what I mean? And I said, I hate basketball. And he stayed on the phone with me until it was time for a meeting. And he just said anything else instead, right? Fold towels, scrub the floor, take a walk, right? Anything, take a nap, have a sandwich, watch a game, right? Anything else instead. And and so there were lots of those little moments with the right person at the right time, with the right information. I had a lot of grief work to do, and did with a lot of sought outside help and a grief counselor that I went to for a year after my dad died. But I was sponsored, and I was sponsoring. I had given my number to a gal before my dad died who couldn't stay sober. She'd been coming in and out for like 9 years at that point. And the night that my dad died, she called. And she didn't care that my dad died. She'd been drinking whiskey and taking Xanax, and she didn't know she should drink some more or go to the ER or come to my house. And then she'd say, I hate you. I don't know why I called, and hang up. And but she absolutely kept me sober that night. She called like every 15 or 20 minutes until like 3 o'clock in the morning. And so that thing in the book that says our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others.
Right.
That's what they're talking about, because I had given her my number from a position of arrogance because I thought the people in West Texas were doing AA wrong. And so I thought, well, no wonder you can't stay sober, but I'm here now, so I'll help you.
Ascending the pedestal, eh?
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. And I mean, I was just like, well, of course you can't stay sober. These people are terrible. And so even, my motive was skewed, right? My motive, the defect at play was arrogance. But God works with what he has available to him. And so that night she called all night. And, she never did get anything like continuous sobriety. She never had more than 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
She never stopped coming, and she didn't die until 2015. So she started coming in 1983, and she just couldn't get it.
The whole time?
The whole time. She never had more than 6 months, and she came the whole time.
That's amazing.
It was incredible. She was such a warrior. She just wanted to be sober, but she would reach this point of discomfort.
Yeah.
That she couldn't get past. She just wasn't willing to be uncomfortable. And then she would go back out, and then she would come back in again. So, yeah, but she helped tons of us because she always called. She always tried, tons of, when she died, the AA community, it was standing room only in that church because we had all tried to help her.
Do you think that in any way that she might have been also battling depression, and from time to time the depression will speak up and say, yeah, the only way around this is a drink?
I think for sure she had some outside issues going on. She was not in agreement about that. And so, but those of us that watched her for sure thought, and of course, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know what it was, but she definitely had something there that she would hit this wall over and over and over and over and over. But she was unwilling to seek any kind of outside help, even with encouragement, even when we said, we'll go with you, we'll take you. She didn't want part of that.
So in a way, she was a real gift to the women and men in the program, but especially the women.
For sure.
You sponsored her, you said. Mm-hmm. Were there other women also who sponsored her over the years?
Oh, yeah. A bunch of us.
A bunch of us.
And my sponsor sponsored her for a while, pretty close to before she passed. I think he was sponsoring her within the last year of her life, and she just couldn't get it.
Well, God bless her for carrying the message of how it still is and how it always is when we don't get it. I've known people like that over the years who the only thing they couldn't do was they couldn't not drink.
That's right.
They could not put the plug in the jug, so to speak. The reality of it is, for the people I've known who just couldn't get it, is some days you don't need to know why they just can't get it. But it does say, you know, some of us, there are those who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover. And you're hoping that you have that kind of influence. But for someone to come in and out for that length of time, it almost becomes a gift to the people who are staying sober, because you have a constant reminder of what it's still like out there. Did you find that to be the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I still do this, but I did in particular with her. But I always ask them when they come back, you know, how was it?
How was it?
You know what I mean? How'd that go? Right.
Yeah.
And they're always like, terrible. And I'll say, I think that's great.
Yeah.
But my home group now, there's a lot of newcomers that come in and out. And when they come back in, I'll say, how'd that go? You know, and they just get to where they just roll their eyes at me. And I'm like, you don't have to do that again if you don't want to. I know. Okay.
When people come back in who I've known who had put together some decent amounts of sobriety, maybe 6 months, a year, 18 months, and they come back in, I always ask them, you know, what happened. I always ask them, what are you going to do differently? But then I also ask them this question: I've been sitting in meetings with you until you slipped, you know, for X number of months or even years, and everything that you said had a spark of truth in it. So what of the things that you were saying turned out not to be true, and thus you went out and drank? You know? And
that's a great question.
I often wonder about that, because they got such great insights when they're sober and talking about what they're going to do and what it's going to be like, and they never quite get it, do they?
Well, I think it's the action. One of the gals that I sponsor, she was sober for a long time, and then she went back out, 90 days ago, she went back out last year and came back in 90 days ago. And then she drank this past week, and she called this morning and said, I have 2 days. And I said, I'm not surprised. And she said, why? And I said, I haven't heard from you. And she's like, well, I was going to meetings. And I was like, but I haven't heard from you. Right. And it's like, we start to trust our instinct. She started to rely on her perception, and then she didn't go to a meeting for 2 or 3 days in a row. And you know what I mean? And then something happened, and she got upset, and she drove to the liquor store, and she was scared and baffled. And it's like, well, no, the actions that are outlined in the book are required to be done every day. I have to do those things every day in order to maintain the connection to the power that keeps me sober. And I think that, you know, when I talk to people who relapse, it's that thing of, you know, there was something that was meant. Maybe they were only going to meetings, or maybe they had stopped going to meetings, or maybe they had stopped sponsoring people, or they never sponsored people, or, you know what I mean? There's always some piece in there that's missing.
Or maybe they just weren't telling you the truth. And that's what I find whenever I see people slip, people I've sponsored. We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA Recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions, missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as they were when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. All of this stuff sounds like God was infused in each one of these things. If there was ever a demonstration
Absolutely.
of God working in a person's life, you've just outlined some amazing things that have happened as a result of staying sober. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind just speaking to the spiritual end of that and how you felt when you first came into AA spiritually versus spiritual growth over the years.
So, it took me some time to come to this realization, but it wasn't that I was ever opposed I am at best, on my very best day, I'm, a believer and full of faith, but I have real periods of agnosticism
me too.
in my sobriety where I question not whether God loves me or not, because I think the evidence is overwhelming, but things happen with people that I care about. And I just think, what is that? But when I came in, I would sort of pray I did ask God to keep me sober every morning, but that was kind of it. And I was 17, and so I was kind of at a dead run and trying to find him and or anything besides y'all, because y'all were old. And so, but I think through that experience, through the year of really after my first daughter was born, and that next few years, probably the next 3 years, there was this consistently, one of my old timers would refer to it as seconds and inches. And there were just one thing after another where just seconds and inches, right? It's just at that moment, I could have left, but something would happen and I would stay. And it started really being clear to me that there was this presence that seemed to be intimately concerned with me being a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. What I realize now, after, step work I realized several years ago, doing inventory, is that I was never really opposed to God or the concept of God or even any kind of religious connotation. I just wanted to be in charge.
Yeah, right.
I was opposed to me not having that job. And so I think, it has become, there was this woman when I got sober, her name was Mona, and she really was 1,000 years old. And she always talked about God, my friend. She would refer to God as her friend. And I remember being like 18, 19 years old, thinking that is the lamest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
And another guy named Jack Clater, who was just incredible. And Jack would just trust God. He just trusted God. And I thought, yeah, because you're 100 years old, who cares, right? I still have to live my life. But what I found is that it has become this relationship with this power. I believe that God is really good at his job, even when I don't understand it. He seems to, and people don't really like to hear this. It's a pretty unpopular stance these days, but I think there is a purpose to everything. I mean, even when we lose people, I don't think it's God's will that my dad committed suicide, but I believe in Alcoholics Anonymous, that becomes something that can become useful.
Yeah.
I don't really subscribe to like it's all random. I don't think it's all random.
Did you get a sense of what your father's spiritual connectedness was?
I think it was way more difficult for him. His upbringing was very different from mine. He was raised by a single mom in the 40s and 50s. His father passed when he was 18 months old. Yeah. And so he was raised by a single mom, Church of Christ, super rigid, super, Jesus loves you and you're going to hell anyway kind of stuff. And so I think he had some of those hurdles. He was very much atheistic, very much a scientist when I was a kid growing up. Very, very into Carl Sagan and all the, the world of the intellect, right?
Yeah.
And I was raised in my mother was Italian Catholic. I was raised up in the Catholic Church, and we went to, I just had a very religious upbringing. And so, but I think his struggle was very different. And I think that he never, I shouldn't say never, but I don't think that he had the sense, like, to his core of how much God really cared about him. You know what I mean? I don't think he had that experience. And so I think that that personal sense of God's really tending to my 2 square feet, even, you know, even when it doesn't feel like it, or even when the days are long, or hard, that there's a reason for this.
Sometimes when you're feeling depressed and hopeless and helpless, the great thing about AA is that if we go to a meeting every day, or 2 or 3 meetings a day, when we are in those feelings, even though it's not any kind of replacement for work that has to be done with the depression itself, but at least we're no further away than maybe a few hours from being in a place where there are people around us who we can look at them and listen to their stories and realize that there is some kind of demonstration that's occurring through those people with relation to an existence of a power greater than ourselves that's running the show. I think one of the first things to go when people get really depressed and hopeless is that belief that God is working in their life. So that's why whenever I encounter someone who's feeling that way, I say, go to more meetings, get your ass in more meetings.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. The other thing that happens for me when I go to a meeting is that I'll accidentally laugh. And that, I mean, you know what I mean? Like I'll go into the meeting really, I don't anymore, but I used to earlier in my recovery. I would go to the meeting really committed to my bad mood and really committed to the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day I was having. And then somebody in the meeting would say something and it would strike me as funny, and I would laugh before I could help myself. And, you know, and my granddaughter and I were talking about that last night, because she's lost both of her grandfathers in the last 18 months. And she is dealing with a lot of grief, and she was crying last night. And then she said something hilarious and we started laughing. And I said to her, you know, it's okay to be sad. Just don't stop laughing.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the key. And I think for me, that's what happens in meetings is I get separated from self, even when I don't want to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Even when I'm committed to myself or self-pity or whatever's going on in my life, right? I get in a room with you guys and maybe somebody is suffering more than, you know, and I can hear that and have a moment of compassion that separates me from self. Or you guys are hilarious, right? And you tell stories and say things that are really funny. And so then I'm laughing. And I think it was Clint Hodges was the speaker from the Pacific group who traveled around Texas a lot in our early sobriety. And I think it was Clint, that it might have been Cliff Roach. One of them used to say, you can't laugh and think at the same time. I heard that a million years ago. And I believe it. You know what I mean? Like I can't laugh and be obsessed with self at the same time.
That's such great advice, especially to newcomers. One of the indicators I've noticed, and I finally at one point decided to pay attention to it on an ongoing basis, the biggest indicator to me that I'm getting or am depressed is when I'm in a meeting and people are saying stuff that's funny and I'm not laughing.
Yes.
I know I'm feeling okay when I'm laughing, but when I'm not laughing, I look around me at everybody laughing. I'm thinking, wait a second.
Oh,
What an indicator that is.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think there's times, you know, there's been times in my sobriety where the grief was extreme.
I'll bet.
And I've had to make a decision. I lost a granddaughter in 2019, and that was maybe the hardest. But I had to make a decision to find joy. Like I had to on purpose every day, because I could feel it. It was like, oh, this is like quicksand. This one's going to eat me alive. And it was like, I have to stay connected in Alcoholics Anonymous. I have to stay. And I told my sponsees, please call. Even if you think it's dumb, call.
Right.
And stayed in touch with my sponsor. But that thing of like, I've got to intentionally find a way to experience God in spite of that grief. things kind of shifted for me then. I became much more practical. Like I will walk outside and put my feet in the grass, or go outside at night and look at the stars, or, right. It's not so much this ritualistic, although I still say the same prayers every morning and every evening, but it's become more of like just in this moment experiencing joy
and claiming it too.
Yeah, and claiming it. But again, I don't suffer from depression, and so it is something that I can ask God for help with and make a decision, like I'm willing, right, for God to bring me to a place where there's joy. I'm willing for God to change me from the inside out, and that's an effective prayer, because what's wrong is alcoholism, right? I think if you suffer from depression, you can be doing all of that, and it feels like God doesn't care because it's not changing, because it's not a spiritual problem.
Right. A stiff handle of whiskey would take care of this real quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the
right.
that's the big danger there. Now, you mentioned you got sober at 17, you said?
I did.
That's amazing. Okay, so I was wondering about what you saw your mother doing with regard to her Al-Anon program that got her through your dad's tragic death.
Yeah, it's very different. We had very different paths. She did not initially get angry, and I was angry.
Yeah.
And so she had more immediate grief, and I had to kind of wade through this. But she had a sponsor at the time. She was living in Virginia. She had a sponsor in Texas, Blanche. And, but she met this woman named Dawn from Chicago. Dawn's been in Al-Anon like 64 years, some ridiculous amount of time. And Dawn had some real experience with grief. And so Mom started talking to Dawn, and she saw a grief counselor every week for a couple of years or a year.
Mm-hmm.
And she has always traveled, and she's I guess you would call it a circuit speaker. She travels all over the country, and she's had to slow down now because of her age. And I think that helped a lot, because very quickly she started to get feedback from people who either had a similar experience or somebody who was suffering from depression that could hear her story and then ask for help. And I think that helped a lot. That my folks got together when they were in high school and got married right after college, and then had us, me and my little brother, and lived through alcoholism, and then we're in recovery together for 8, almost 9 years. And, that's just, my dad was just it for her.
Yeah.
And so I really think she's built a life for herself, with Al-Anon being the foundation for that.
Your mother was in Al-Anon during the time at which you were still out there before you got to AA. What kind of impact did your mom being in Al-Anon have on your decision to get sober, or was there none?
Oh, no, that definitely changed things. My friend Billy says, you hear in AA all the time that there's nothing worse than a head full of AA and a belly full of booze.
Right.
And he says, actually, what's worse is a belly full of booze and a mom in Al-Anon. I concur. Oh, yeah. The first time I heard him say it from the podium, I literally yelled that we were at a conference, and I literally went, preach, because, oh my God. I am certain that the reason that I was able to get sober as young as I was is because they knew what they were dealing with. My parents, both of my parents were effectively sponsored, and they left me alone. They didn't try to help. They didn't offer me any money. They didn't make me a sandwich. They didn't tolerate my behavior. Nothing, right? And so I was really fortunate in that, they came to me. I had hit a bottom, and a friend had called my folks and said, she's in terrible shape. And they came to me and said, are you willing to do what we ask you to do? And are you willing to stop drinking? And I agreed. I didn't mean it, but I agreed just so I could sleep indoors. But they did not change their tune. Like I got out of treatment. I went to a halfway house and I came back to Austin from the halfway house. And I said to my dad, like, I would like to have my college money because I'm going to go to college now. And he said, what college money? And I was like, dude, I know you've been putting money away since I was a kid, since I was born. I know there's college money. He said, how do you think I paid for treatment?
Oh, jeez.
And I was like, what?
Oh, no.
And so he said, you want to go to college? Go get a job. And so I got a job and I went to college and I went to meetings. And like they just didn't do a lot of the things that I see people doing that are detrimental. And not from a negative place, but just people don't understand what they're dealing with. And so, it seems like offering them money or offering them a place to stay or offering us money or a place to stay or a hand up would be the right thing, but it's not. It delays the inevitable, right? And so I think that's what, for me, I really believe because they were in recovery, they knew what they were dealing with me, and they were both effectively sponsored. I really had the opportunity to hit bottom very quickly and then, have to kind of find my own way to stay sober.
Bottom at 17 is amazing. There aren't a whole lot of people out there who have that. Do you think that had your parents been the kind of enablers or because I've known people like that too, who wait until their kids are almost dead before they realize there's nothing they can do, and that's when they finally let go. Yeah. Do you feel like you might have survived if your folks had done that? Would you have been resistant to their help if they were the type of parents who withheld things or cajoled or forced sobriety?
It for sure wouldn't look like it looks now. There's no way. I was so manipulative and dishonest. I would have really taken advantage of that.
How long had you been drinking by the time you got sober?
4 years.
So from the time you were 13 till you were 17?
Mm-hmm. But, at 15, when he got sober, I was just turned 16 when he got sober. They just said, you can't drink like you drink and live here, right? There were consequences for my behavior. Mm-hmm. And because they were in recovery and effectively sponsored, they weren't threats. They were consequences. You know what I mean? When he was drinking, there was always just threats. They'd say, my mother was famous. She would always say, if you do that one more time, blah, blah, blah. And then we'd do it again. And she'd say, if you do that one more time. And so we didn't believe anything, but they got into recovery, and instead of being threats, they became consequences. Mm-hmm. But by then I was on the ride, and so they said, you can't live here and drink like you drink. I said, cool, gotta go. And I thought it was my idea. You know what I mean? I mean, it was just like, my family doesn't love me and I've been abandoned by my parents. And it was just the saddest story. None of it true.
So you didn't have to go out like a lot of people do when they're that young.
No, I came in and stayed. I've been here since my very first meeting. I never left.
That's astonishing.
It is astonishing. And again, like when you talk about the presence of God, like in 1987, there were no adolescent treatment centers in Texas. There was one in Baton Rouge.
Right.
And they had them in Florida, Minnesota, California, and maybe New York. But there weren't any in Texas. And so I ended up getting through my dad's sponsor who knew somebody that knew somebody, right? I ended up getting into an adult treatment facility. But it was in Denton, which is, north of Dallas. So not my hometown, not where my drinking buddies were. Not that I have any drinking buddies left, but not where I could wander off. Mm-hmm. And from there, they had connections with somebody who knew somebody that knew about a sober women's halfway house and outside of St. Paul, Minnesota. And so in the beginning of May of 87, or the end of April, somewhere in there, I went to this. I was still 17. And so my parents still had the authority to make a decision. And so they made this decision to send me to Minnesota. And what that did was bought me time away from my environment, away from anything that was familiar. I didn't know where Minnesota was in relation to anything.
Were you resistant at that point? I mean, if your folks had said we're not going to do it, would you have been relieved or
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Huh.
I was 118 days dry before I had an honest desire to stay sober. So if they had kicked me back to Austin at 28 days, I would have gone right back to what I had been doing.
So you needed that. You needed that additional.
I did. Yeah, I needed to be removed from my environment for an extended period of time. And I got that. I had that opportunity. And so I think that made all the difference in the world, because at 118 days, I say this all the time, but it's the truth. You know, I didn't want what you guys had, for sure. But at 118 days, I didn't want what I had anymore. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Like, I didn't want to go back to the streets.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to stay here because this was like horrible to me, but I didn't want to go back to the street. It was just one more thing, right? That one more little God moment where it's like, you know, you can look back on all those seconds and inches, all those things that had to fall into place, where it was like, at some point you just have to like go, I think God means for me to be a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I should probably figure out how to do that well. That's what I've been doing.
It sounds like you have. Your story is so exceptional with recovery. It's like the inverse of a regular speaker meeting where they spend 45 minutes talking about what it was like, another 10 minutes talking about what happened, and they leave about 5 minutes at the end, and they say, and then I got sober and everything's been great for the last 30 years. What part of the story you revealed today was that you spent your time talking about the solution. You spent your time talking about the about all of the elements that went into making you who you are as a sober woman today. And I really appreciate that and the way you handled that. And it was very easy to listen to what you were saying and gain a sense that you must be a real inspiration to the women who you work with. Tell me about some of them.
You know, they're my life. I just adore them. I'll tell you, there's a couple. The one that's so amazing to me is I'm sponsoring a gal that lives on the northeast coast of England. She lives in a little bitty community where there's not Alcoholics Anonymous.
Uh-huh.
And she had, we were attending a Zoom meeting together. I had seen her name on the screen, but she always had her camera off, but I was greeting people. That's my favorite job.
Me too.
And I love to be the greeter. I love to be the greeter.
Me too.
And people are always like, will you speak? And I'm like, I don't want to. I want to greet. Will you chair? No, I don't want to chair. I want to greet. And anyway, so I was greeting people. And before the meeting, we get on early, and there was a lot of laughter and she had gotten involved tragically with a group in England that presented themselves as Alcoholics Anonymous, but is not, and was taking money and was very controlling and very scary. And so she emailed me and said, you know, this is who I am. This is what's happening in my life. I'm not okay. She'd been sober about 14 months. Mm-hmm. And she said, I need help. And I emailed her back and said, what you're doing is not Alcoholics Anonymous. We do not require you to make a payment. We do not have an opinion about how you live your life or where you spend your time. Mm-hmm. I'd be happy to help you. And we went through the steps over Zoom. And she's been sober now 3.5 years.
Wow. And
she is they've started a meeting close to her. She's taking a meeting into the hospital now.
Wow.
She has a institutions commitment, and she's sponsoring. And she will be speaking later on today at a meeting. If I can get there, I'm going to try and get there. It's just those things, like the way that Alcoholics Anonymous transmit in any condition, right? Whether it's Zoom or in person or on the phone or how the steps work and how God shows up in that. It's just amazing to me, you know. And I do sponsor a lot of different men and women, and you know, they call it exactly the right moment I'm in the weeds of my day and I'm just like, and then they'll call and I'm like, oh, thank God.
And it's with the same kind of issues that I'm feeling at that time, too.
Yes, always. I'll say the thing where I think, oh, well, it would be cool if you were actually practicing that, Laura. You know what I mean? Like, that sounds like great advice. Maybe you should review
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
And I tell them that, right? I'll say, oh, I'm so glad you called because I needed to be reminded to pause and seek counsel. And so, it really is they're just such a gift. And they're so thoughtful in a million different ways. A couple of them will send thank you cards to my granddaughter 2 or 3 times a year, just saying, thanks for sharing your Nona with us. And we know we take up her time on the phone. And I mean, just the kindest, and their moms and their wives and their grandmother, just watching those lives be restored, having a front row seat for that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing.
You know what I've found over the years, Laura, is that, and from the very beginning, that I needed a mix of mixed meetings and also men's only meetings. What's been your experience with women's meetings versus mixed meetings over the years?
I don't do them. And I tell you, for a couple of reasons. I would be more comfortable in a men's meeting. That's the truth. The women's meetings that I have experienced and the conferences that are women-only conferences that I've been invited to attend have this frothy emotional appeal feel to them. And I found that to be very ineffective over the years. I'm not a fan. But I also think today in particular, we have a lot of special interests in Alcoholics Anonymous, more than I've ever seen before. And it concerns me that we are addressing something besides alcoholism.
It's hard to keep that out of the rooms, isn't it?
It's very difficult. But I think it's also very dangerous, that if you have alcoholism, we have a solution, right? Period, the end. I don't care if you're a purple dinosaur. If you have alcoholism, we have a solution. And so I think what I see is people who, and I see it at my home group, these new guys that come in and they want to lead with their difference. They want to present to me why their case is, well, I just got out of prison. I don't care where you came from. Do you have a drinking problem?
Right.
I was abused. I don't, welcome, grab a chair, right? And so I think I'm always aware of anything that gives the disease of alcoholism a foot in the door. And I think that individuality, anything that creates that special interest, whether it's skin color or race or past experience, I just think we do not do anyone any favors by allowing that. And when you and I got sober, right, it was like there were doctors meetings, and it was so weird, or attorneys meetings. Those were the things. There was like a doctor's meeting in Austin and an attorney's meeting in Austin. So what is that about? And so I've always found that, and that's just my personal. Obviously, there are people who love women's meetings, and there are people who are effective and carrying the message and staying sober and doing tremendous work with other women in that environment. It's just not a fit for me.
The biggest reason I've heard over the years from those women I'm close to, and I've got quite a few, typically when the women I've known have gotten turned off to the mixed meetings because they're being either hit upon or something's going on with the men in the group that makes that environment feel not safe. And their only respite, or they feel their only respite, is a same-sex meeting. Now in Houston, there are 1,800 meetings a week, so you can, if you feel like you're being approached too often in the wrong way in a mixed meeting, there are other mixed meetings you can go to where that's not the case. But
sure, and I think that's very much an experience thing. When I came in, obviously I was very young, and there were obviously people who tried to take advantage of that. But the old timers were, I would go tell one of the guys that had been sober 40 years and was 100 years old, like, hey, that guy over there is trying to hit on me, and they would handle it for me. But also, I handled that stuff myself when I was drinking. And this one woman who I thought really didn't like me very much said, what would you do if you were on the street? And I was like, oh. And she said, would you have allowed that when you were? And I was like, oh. And so I've gotten very good at addressing that.
Yeah.
But it was a different time then.
Yeah, it was.
And it is a very different environment now. And a lot of the women that I sponsor attend women's meetings and are very comfortable there.
Yeah.
Right.
They got to go where they feel comfortable and wanted and loved and cared for.
Absolutely.
If you could say anything to somebody who is resisting the program to the same extent that you might have had you not been given what you were given by your folks, the understanding and the room to be your own person, what would you say to somebody who is that resistant that might make a difference? Not trying to get them to come in necessarily, but maybe to give them some hope that they put away and look at down the road, or maybe they look at it immediately.
I think, and I try to say this anytime that I'm visiting with someone that's new or talking to someone that's not new yet. I really spend the majority of my days comfortable in my own skin, doing what I'm doing with the people I'm doing it with, not thirsty. And the opposite of that was entirely true when I got here. And the other thing that really holds true, even though it's like such a cliche, and I hated it when I was new, but it is so true, is that, you know what, give us 90 days, right? And we will gladly refund your misery. You know what I mean?
Right.
Give us 90 days, right? 100% committed. Do the things that we do for 90 days. No breaks, no exceptions to the rule. Just follow, even though it doesn't make any sense and it's stupid, and it can't possibly have anything to do with your drinking problems, give us 90 days. Because that's really the deal. Is like, what have you got to lose, right? I mean, the disease is waiting, right? You can have all of that back.
Well, it sounds like the woman you were talking about earlier. Maybe one day it takes, maybe it never does.
Right. Someday, I mean, I do also remind people when they call and they'll say, I just want to drink. And I do remind them that no, they don't, or they wouldn't have called. Right. And so sometimes it's something as simple as that. Sometimes it's something as saying, no, you really want to recover. Right. And let me, I can help. I have a solution. And it works 100. If you have alcoholism, I've got a solution. It works 100% of the time. If you do what we do.
No matter what.
And no matter what. Take the action. Whether you feel like it or believe in it or agree with it is irrelevant. Take the action.
And if you want
a lot of people get stuck, right? A lot of people get stuck trying to agree with what we're doing. I don't. It doesn't make sense to me now. You know what I mean? I don't disagree with it anymore, but it still doesn't. I'm like, I don't know how it works. Beats me, but it does.
Yeah.
So I think I don't have to understand it or agree with it or like it.
Right.
I just got to take the action.
Just got to do it. Just got to do it. Yeah, absolutely. I just love the way you present yourself and the service work that you do for your program.
Thank you.
My guess is that the Austin AA community has been greatly enriched by your involvement.
Oh, thank you.
So what I want to say is thank you for doing such a marvelous job.
Thank you for asking me to do this. This was fun.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I look forward to next time I get to Austin, get another chance to see you and listen to your wisdom again. Again, many thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. I want to thank my guest, Laura B., for sharing her story, and thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you do a little service work by spreading the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. AA Recovery Interviews is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all other podcast providers. Or visit our website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs, and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.